In the spring of 1908, a railway surveyor working for the Union Pacific Railroad made a discovery that would haunt Las Vegas for over a century. While mapping potential expansion routes through the desert valley, just 3 years after the city's founding land auction, he stumbled upon what appeared to be a small, unmarked cemetery hidden behind a cluster of Joshua trees, approximately 4 miles southwest of the rapidly growing railroad town. What made this discovery truly disturbing wasn't the presence of graves in the harsh Nevada landscape. It was the meticulous arrangement of exactly 89 burial mounds, each precisely 6 feet apart, forming a perfect grid pattern that seemed to follow some inexplicable design. The surveyor's official report, sealed in Union Pacific Railroad archives until 1987, contained a single haunting observation. The soil composition suggests all burials occurred within a concentrated time frame, estimated between late 1905 and early 1908. Local residents, many of whom had arrived for the famous May 1905 land auction that established Las Vegas, claimed no knowledge of any cemetery in that location, and the newly formed territorial records showed no permits for such an extensive burial ground. For over 70 years, the railroad company quietly rerouted their tracks to avoid the site, and the few locals who knew of its existence spoke of it only in whispers, referring to it as Henderson's Harvest. What you're about to hear is the true story behind those 89 graves, a tale that began with the American dream of land ownership in a booming frontier town and ended with the most systematic killing spree in Nevada Territory's history. Before we continue with the story of the Henderson family and their dark secret, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the mysteries that others fear to tell. If you're one of those rare individuals who seeks the truth behind America's darkest secrets, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We're building a community of true mystery seekers, and your story might be next. Now, let's discover what really happened in the desert outside the newly founded city of Las Vegas between 1905 and 1908. When Senator William Clark's famous land auction concluded on May 15, 1905, Las Vegas transformed overnight from a railroad water stop into a thriving frontier boomtown. The completion of the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad had created opportunities that drew thousands of hopeful settlers to the Nevada desert, each carrying dreams of prosperity in America's newest railroad city. Among the prospective buyers who missed the initial auction but arrived in its aftermath was Jeremiah Henderson, a 42-year-old former cattle rancher from Utah Territory who had lost everything in a series of harsh winters and failed investments. He reached Las Vegas in August 1905 with his wife Sarah, their 3 children, and exactly $63. Not enough to purchase prime city lots, but sufficient to establish a foothold in the growing community. The Henderson family initially settled on a homestead claim 6 miles southeast of the new city center, where Jeremiah established a way station providing supplies, meals, and shelter to the constant stream of travelers arriving by rail and wagon. Sarah, a devout Mormon woman with extensive knowledge of frontier medicine, quickly became known throughout the scattered community for her skill in treating everything from snake bites to fever. Their children, Mary, 15, Samuel, 12, and little Rebecca, 8, adapted to desert life while watching their family's circumstances gradually improve as Las Vegas grew around them. But Jeremiah harbored larger ambitions than running a simple way station. He had his eye on several choice lots near the railroad depot, properties that had sold for premium prices during the May auction and were now worth even more as the city expanded. The problem was clear. Established businessmen from Los Angeles and Salt Lake City controlled the most valuable real estate, and a struggling homesteader had little chance of competing with their resources. The Las Vegas of late 1905 was a rough, rapidly growing railroad town where fortunes could be made overnight and men reinvented themselves daily. The population swelled from the original auction buyers to include railroad workers, merchants, prospectors heading to the nearby mining districts, and the inevitable collection of gamblers, confidence men, and others seeking opportunities in a place where few questions were asked about a man's past. This influx of transient population created both opportunities and challenges for families like the Hendersons. The constant stream of travelers provided customers for their way station, but it also brought dangerous men carrying significant amounts of money through a region where law enforcement was sparse and territorial authority remained largely theoretical. Jeremiah understood that success in this environment required more than hard work and honest dealing. It required the kind of bold opportunism that had built many frontier fortunes, and he was prepared to embrace methods that might have seemed unthinkable in the settled communities he had left behind. The transformation of Jeremiah Henderson from struggling homesteader to something far more sinister began on a sweltering September morning in 1905, when a man calling himself Thomas Edwards arrived at their way station with an unusual request and a story that immediately aroused Jeremiah's interest. Edwards claimed to be a former railroad supervisor fleeing embezzlement charges in California. He carried a substantial roll of bills, quality gear, and the nervous demeanor of a man who understood that his freedom depended on his ability to disappear completely. More importantly, he had heard rumors that certain isolated homesteads in Nevada Territory provided services beyond simple food and shelter for travelers with particular needs. The conversation between Edwards and Jeremiah took place in the small cabin that served as their family's parlor, while Sarah prepared the evening meal and the children completed their daily chores. Edwards was direct about his situation. He needed to vanish entirely, with no possibility that his previous identity could ever be traced or discovered. He was willing to pay handsomely for such a service. "I've heard," Edwards said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that a man with money and the right connections can simply disappear out here, become someone else entirely. I'm prepared to pay $500 for that kind of assistance." $500 represented more money than the Henderson family had seen in the previous 2 years combined. For Jeremiah, who had been calculating daily how long their meager savings would last and whether they could survive another harsh desert winter, Edwards' offer presented both an opportunity and a test of his willingness to abandon conventional morality in pursuit of financial security. The solution that Jeremiah devised was both simple and monstrous. That night, while Edwards slept in the traveler's cabin, Jeremiah entered quietly and suffocated him with a pillow. The murder was carried out with methodical precision, ensuring that there were no signs of struggle and no evidence that would attract unwanted attention from any law enforcement officials who might eventually inquire about missing travelers. The disposal of Edwards' body established a pattern that would be repeated dozens of times over the following 3 years. Jeremiah buried the corpse in a carefully measured grave in the desert behind their homestead, marking the location with a small stone bearing only the number 1. Edwards' money, horses, and equipment were either used by the family or sold discreetly in Las Vegas, with Jeremiah claiming that his client had decided to continue his journey to California during the early morning hours. But the most significant aspect of Edwards' murder was not the crime itself, but Jeremiah's psychological response to it. Rather than experiencing guilt or revulsion, he found himself analyzing the operation for potential improvements in efficiency and security. He had discovered that he possessed both the emotional detachment and the practical skills necessary to solve his family's financial problems through systematic murder. The success of the Edwards operation convinced Jeremiah that he had found his calling. Within 2 weeks, he had begun quietly spreading word through Las Vegas's saloons and boarding houses that his homestead could provide special assistance to travelers who needed to start fresh in life. He was careful to target only men who were already fugitives from the law, reasoning that their disappearances would be less likely to attract investigation. Samuel Henderson, who had always been an observant child, began to notice changes in his father's behavior and their family's circumstances that he couldn't fully understand, but found deeply troubling. The boy had seen Edwards arrive at their homestead, had shared meals with him, and had even helped him care for his horses. When his father explained that Edwards had departed before dawn, Samuel's questions about the man's abandoned possessions were dismissed with harsh warnings about the importance of minding his own business. As autumn arrived in the Nevada desert in 1905, the Henderson family's circumstances began to change in ways that reflected both the growth of Las Vegas as a boomtown and Jeremiah's increasing sophistication as a predator. The completion of the railroad connection had brought unprecedented prosperity to the region, and the Henderson way station benefited from the constant stream of travelers, railroad workers, and entrepreneurs passing through the area. But beneath the surface of this apparent legitimate success, Jeremiah had begun to systematically develop what he privately called his disappearing service. The murder of Thomas Edwards had been followed by 3 more carefully planned killings before the end of 1905, each targeting men who had approached him seeking assistance in escaping their criminal pasts. Jeremiah's victims during this period included a former cavalry deserter carrying stolen army payroll money, a confidence man fleeing fraud charges in Colorado, and a cattle rustler wanted for murder in Arizona territory. Each man had been drawn to the Henderson homestead by carefully planted rumors about a place where desperate men could find help in starting new lives with new identities. The selection process was methodical and cruel. Jeremiah would engage potential clients in detailed conversations about their circumstances, evaluating both their financial resources and the likelihood that their disappearances would attract law enforcement attention. Men with substantial money but few personal connections were ideal targets, while those with family members or business partners who might investigate their disappearances were politely turned away. Sarah Henderson's role in these crimes was complex and tragic. While she was not initially aware of her husband's activities, she had begun to notice inconsistencies in his explanations for their improved financial circumstances and the regular appearance and disappearance of travelers at their homestead. Her suspicions were aroused further by changes in Jeremiah's personality and behavior that seemed to reflect a growing callousness toward human life. The breaking point came in December 1905, when Sarah discovered her husband's journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their bedroom. The leather-bound book contained detailed records of 7 murders, including descriptions of the victims, estimates of their financial resources, and precise locations of their burial sites. Most chilling of all were Jeremiah's clinical observations about improving his methods and expanding his operation. The confrontation between Sarah and Jeremiah that followed this discovery revealed the full extent of his moral corruption and his plans for their family's future. Rather than expressing remorse or agreeing to stop the killings, Jeremiah explained his actions with the cold logic of a businessman pursuing a profitable enterprise. "These men are already dead," he told his wife, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "They've committed crimes that have put them beyond redemption, and they can never return to the lives they had before. What I'm offering them is peace, permanent peace, and what they're offering me is the means to secure our family's future in this new city." Jeremiah's vision extended far beyond simply accumulating money through murder. He had been studying Las Vegas's rapid growth and had identified specific properties near the railroad depot that he believed would make his family wealthy as the city continued to expand. His calculations indicated that he would need to complete approximately 89 successful operations to generate sufficient funds to purchase these properties and establish himself as a legitimate businessman. Sarah's response to these revelations was shaped by both horror at her husband's crimes and terror for her family's safety. She understood that Jeremiah had become something monstrous, but she also understood that any attempt to expose him would likely result in her own death and the destruction of her children. The knowledge that she was married to a serial killer was almost unbearable, but the knowledge that she was now complicit in his crimes was even worse. The psychological pressure on the Henderson family intensified dramatically as Jeremiah's operation expanded throughout 1906. Samuel had begun keeping his own careful count of the men who visited their homestead and never departed, while Sarah struggled with the moral implications of preparing meals and providing comfort to men she knew were going to be murdered. Young Mary and Rebecca remained largely unaware of the true nature of their family's circumstances, but they had begun to notice the tension between their parents and Samuel's increasingly withdrawn behavior. Their innocent questions about these changes added another layer of stress to an already impossible situation. As 1906 progressed, Jeremiah's victims came to include an increasingly diverse range of criminals and fugitives drawn by his growing reputation throughout the Southwest. Railroad workers spread word of the Henderson homestead through their networks, and wanted men began arriving from as far away as Texas and California, seeking the special services that Jeremiah provided. Each successful operation made Jeremiah more confident and more ambitious. He began charging higher fees, targeting wealthier victims, and planning for the eventual expansion of his enterprise beyond Nevada territory. Most significantly, he began to view his family members not as loved ones to be protected, but as potential liabilities to be managed in service of his larger goals. By the beginning of 1907, Las Vegas had evolved from a tent city into an established railroad town with over 1,500 permanent residents, legitimate businesses, and the first elements of formal law enforcement. This growth brought new opportunities for legitimate entrepreneurs, but it also created new challenges for men like Jeremiah Henderson, who depended on the lawless atmosphere of a frontier community for their criminal enterprises. The establishment of a town marshal's office in early 1907 represented the first serious threat to Jeremiah's operation since he had begun killing travelers 18 months earlier. Marshal William Bill Thompson was a former railroad detective who had been hired specifically to address the growing problems of crime and violence that accompanied Las Vegas's rapid expansion. Thompson's arrival coincided with an increase in inquiries about missing persons that had begun to concern territorial authorities in Carson City. Representatives from railroad companies, mining operations, and law enforcement agencies in other territories had begun asking questions about men who had disappeared while traveling through the Las Vegas area. While none of these inquiries had yet focused specifically on the Henderson homestead, Jeremiah understood that his activities were beginning to attract the kind of attention that could prove fatal to his operation. The solution that Jeremiah devised was both audacious and terrifying in its implications. Rather than reducing his activities or exercising greater caution, he decided to accelerate his timeline and complete his planned 89 murders before law enforcement agencies could coordinate their investigations effectively. This decision required him to abandon his previous careful selection process and begin actively hunting for victims rather than waiting for them to seek his services. The winter and spring of 1907 marked the deadliest period of the Henderson killing spree. Working with two associates he had recruited from Las Vegas's criminal underworld, Marcus Webb, a former Confederate soldier with experience in systematic violence, and James Pike, an Army deserter with skills in tracking and disposal of evidence, Jeremiah began targeting solitary travelers on the roads leading to and from Las Vegas. This expansion of operations required new methods and greater risks. Rather than simply waiting for fugitive criminals to seek assistance, the Henderson gang began robbing and murdering prospectors, traveling salesmen, and anyone else who appeared to be carrying substantial amounts of money or valuables. The careful screening process that had previously protected them from unwanted attention was abandoned in favor of rapid accumulation of the funds needed to complete Jeremiah's land acquisition plan. The psychological impact of this escalation on the Henderson family was devastating. Sarah had been documenting her husband's crimes in her own secret journal, partly as evidence for potential future use and partly as a way of maintaining some sense of control over the nightmare her life had become. By the summer of 1907, her records indicated that Jeremiah had murdered over 60 men, and she understood that his accelerating timeline meant that many more would die before he completed his plan. Samuel Henderson, now 13 years old, had begun experiencing severe psychological distress as a result of his knowledge of his father's activities. The boy had located the burial ground behind their homestead and had seen enough to understand the full scope of Jeremiah's crimes. The weight of this knowledge was crushing for a child who loved his father, but could no longer deny that the man had become a monster. The situation became even more complex when Samuel realized that his father was planning to murder him and his mother once the operation was complete. Jeremiah had become increasingly paranoid about potential witnesses, and he had begun making comments that suggested he viewed his own family members as liabilities that would need to be eliminated to ensure his safety. The crisis reached its peak in the late summer of 1907, when Marshal Thompson began conducting a systematic investigation of missing persons reports that had accumulated over the previous 2 years. Thompson was an experienced investigator who understood that the pattern of disappearances in the Las Vegas area was too consistent to be coincidental, and he had begun developing a list of potential suspects and locations that warranted closer examination. The Henderson homestead appeared on Thompson's list because of reports from several travelers who had mentioned stopping there for supplies and shelter. While none of these reports were suspicious in themselves, the marshal's methodical approach to the investigation meant that he would eventually visit the Henderson property as part of his comprehensive review of potential crime scenes. Jeremiah's response to the news of Thompson's investigation revealed both his resourcefulness and his complete moral corruption. Rather than fleeing or attempting to hide evidence of his crimes, he began planning the marshal's murder, reasoning that eliminating the investigator would buy him sufficient time to complete his operation and escape to California with his accumulated wealth. The plan to murder Marshal Thompson required careful coordination with Webb and Pike, who had been promised substantial payments for their assistance in completing the final phase of Jeremiah's scheme. The 3 men spent weeks studying Thompson's routines and developing a strategy that would allow them to kill him without attracting immediate attention from territorial authorities in Carson City. The autumn of 1907 brought a series of events that would ultimately lead to the exposure of the Henderson family's crimes, beginning with the arrival of 2 men whose presence at the homestead would trigger a chain reaction of violence and revelation that no one could have anticipated. Theodore Brackman was a railroad investor from San Francisco who had been monitoring Las Vegas's growth with interest in potential real estate acquisitions. His investigation of property values and ownership patterns had led him to notice that Jeremiah Henderson, a man who had arrived in the area with virtually no resources, had somehow accumulated sufficient funds to make serious inquiries about purchasing some of the city's most valuable commercial properties. Brackman's business instincts told him that Henderson's sudden prosperity warranted investigation, particularly given the consistent reports of missing travelers that had begun to concern railroad officials. As a major investor in the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad, Brackman had access to both official reports and informal networks of information that allowed him to piece together a disturbing pattern of disappearances that seemed to center on the Henderson homestead. The second significant arrival was Deputy Territorial Marshal James Collins, who had been assigned to assist Marshal Thompson in his investigation of missing persons in the Las Vegas area. Collins was a methodical lawman with extensive experience in similar cases throughout the Western Territories, and he brought both expertise and resources that posed a serious threat to Jeremiah's operation. Collins' arrival in Las Vegas coincided with the disappearance of a wealthy cattle buyer named Robert Sterling, whose family had retained a private detective agency to investigate his failure to return from a business trip to Nevada Territory. Sterling had last been seen leaving Las Vegas with supplies purchased at a local merchant store, heading in the direction of several ranches that included the Henderson homestead. The investigation of Sterling's disappearance was complicated by the fact that he had been carrying over $3,000 in cash intended for cattle purchases, making him an attractive target for robbery. However, Collins' experience with similar cases led him to suspect that Sterling's disappearance might be connected to the broader pattern of missing persons that had brought him to Las Vegas. Jeremiah's response to these developments revealed both his desperation and his willingness to escalate his criminal activities to protect his operation. Working with Webb and Pike, he began planning a series of murders that would eliminate both the immediate threats to his safety and several additional victims whose deaths would provide the final funds needed to complete his land acquisition plan. The plan that emerged from these discussions was ambitious and terrifying in its scope. Jeremiah proposed to murder Collins, Brackman, Marshall Thompson, and several other potential witnesses in a coordinated series of killings that would be disguised as random acts of frontier violence. The murders would be timed to coincide with his acquisition of the targeted properties, after which he would flee to California with Sarah and the children, leaving Webb and Pike to face any subsequent investigation. Sarah Henderson's discovery of this plan marked the final breaking point in her psychological ability to remain silent about her husband's crimes. The prospect of witnessing the murder of law enforcement officers and innocent businessmen was more than she could bear, particularly when she understood that Jeremiah's ultimate plan involved killing her and Samuel to eliminate potential witnesses. The confrontation between Sarah and Jeremiah that followed her discovery of his latest plans was violent and revealing. For the first time in their marriage, Sarah directly challenged her husband's authority and threatened to expose his crimes if he proceeded with his planned murders. Jeremiah's response was to threaten her life and the lives of their children, making it clear that he now viewed his own family as obstacles to be eliminated rather than loved ones to be protected. Samuel Henderson's decision to take action was motivated not by abstract moral principles, but by the immediate understanding that his father was planning to murder him, his mother, and his sisters. The boy had been considering various options for exposing Jeremiah's crimes for months, but the knowledge that his family faced imminent death forced him to act despite the personal consequences. The plan that Samuel developed was both simple and dangerous. He would wait for an opportunity when Jeremiah, Webb, and Pike were away from the homestead, then ride to Las Vegas and report everything to Marshall Thompson and Deputy Collins. He would provide the location of the burial ground, copies of the journals kept by both his father and mother, and detailed testimony about the murders he had witnessed. The night that Samuel chose for his mission was the same night that Jeremiah planned to begin his final series of murders. The boy watched from his bedroom window as his father and his associates prepared to leave the homestead, carrying weapons and equipment that made their violent intentions clear. Samuel waited until the three men had been gone for 2 hours before making his move. He saddled his horse in darkness and began the dangerous night ride to Las Vegas, carrying with him evidence that would expose one of the most systematic killing sprees in American frontier history. The ride to town took 4 hours through difficult desert terrain, and Samuel spent that time rehearsing the words that would destroy his family and save countless future victims. He understood that his testimony would result in his father's execution, but he also understood that silence would result in the deaths of many more innocent people, including his own mother and sisters. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Henderson family story intensifies. If this tale is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth behind those 89 graves is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Let's discover together what happens when a 13-year-old boy makes the most difficult decision of his life to stop his father's reign of terror. Marshall Thompson and Deputy Collins received Samuel Henderson's report in the early morning hours of October 15, 1907, in the Marshal's office on Fremont Street. The boy's story was so horrific that both lawmen initially struggled to believe it. But the evidence he provided, including detailed journals documenting over 70 murders, was compelling and specific enough to demand immediate action. Samuel's testimony included precise directions to the burial ground, descriptions of his father's methods, and most importantly, information about Jeremiah's immediate plans to murder law enforcement officers and other potential witnesses. The urgency of this intelligence meant that Thompson and Collins had to act quickly before Jeremiah could complete his planned killings and escape to California. The Marshal's immediate response was to organize a search party consisting of himself, Collins, 3 deputized railroad men, and Theodore Brackman, who had requested permission to participate as a representative of civilian authorities concerned about the safety of travelers in the area. The party was armed and prepared for violent resistance, as Samuel had warned them that his father and his associates would fight rather than surrender. The confrontation occurred at dawn on October 16, 1907, at the Henderson homestead. The search party arrived expecting to find the family sleeping, but instead discovered a scene of chaos and preparation for flight that confirmed Samuel's warnings about his father's intentions. Sarah Henderson was found in the kitchen, bound and gagged, but alive. She had been beaten and threatened during the night, but Jeremiah had not yet carried out his plan to kill her. The younger children, Mary and Rebecca, were discovered hiding in the root cellar, traumatized but unharmed. The gun battle with Jeremiah, Webb and Pike took place at the burial ground, where the three men had been attempting to destroy evidence of their crimes by relocating some of the bodies. The fight was brief but intense, resulting in the deaths of Webb and Pike and the serious wounding of Jeremiah Henderson. As the smoke cleared and the surviving members of the search party surveyed the scene, the full scope of the Henderson murders began to emerge. The burial ground contained exactly 87 bodies, each buried according to the precise measurements that Jeremiah had recorded in his journal. The victims' identities would later be established through a combination of missing person reports, personal effects found at the crime scenes, and the detailed records kept by both Jeremiah and Sarah. Jeremiah's capture marked the end of what territorial authorities would later classify as the most systematic and prolonged murder spree in Nevada's history. But it also marked the beginning of a legal and social controversy that would continue for years as the community struggled to understand how an ordinary frontier family had become involved in such monstrous crimes. The immediate aftermath of the gun battle was chaotic and emotionally devastating for all involved. Samuel Henderson, who had ridden back to the homestead with the search party, was forced to watch as his wounded father was taken into custody, while his mother and sisters were placed under protective care, pending the investigation. Jeremiah's first words after his capture were not expressions of remorse or explanations of his motives, but calculations about the money he had accumulated and complaints that his plan had been incomplete. Even as he lay bleeding from his gunshot wounds, he continued to view his crimes in purely financial terms, expressing regret only that he had not been able to complete his acquisition of the Las Vegas properties that had motivated his killing spree. The excavation of the burial ground, which took place over the following 2 weeks, revealed evidence of planning and organization that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. Each grave had been precisely measured and marked, and the bodies had been buried with methodical care that suggested Jeremiah had viewed his murders not as crimes of passion or desperation, but as routine business operations. The discovery of personal effects, money and jewelry buried with the victims provided crucial evidence for the prosecution case that would follow. More importantly, it allowed territorial authorities to begin the process of identifying the dead and notifying their families, bringing closure to dozens of missing person cases that had remained unsolved for years. The trial of Jeremiah Henderson, which took place in Carson City during the spring of 1908, became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Nevada Territory's history. Newspaper reporters from across the western United States traveled to cover the case, and the courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to hear details of what the press had dubbed the Henderson Horror. The prosecution's case was built primarily on the testimony of Samuel Henderson, the evidence contained in the journals kept by both Jeremiah and Sarah, and the physical evidence recovered from the burial ground. The systematic nature of the crimes, combined with the detailed documentation of the murders, made conviction virtually certain despite the efforts of Jeremiah's court-appointed defense attorney. Jeremiah's behavior during the trial revealed the complete absence of remorse or human feeling that had characterized his crimes. He showed no emotion when confronted with evidence of his murders, no sympathy for the families of his victims, and no recognition that his actions had been morally wrong. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he used the time to complain about the interruption of his business plans rather than to express any regret for the lives he had taken. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Samuel Henderson testified about his father's crimes and his own decision to expose them. The boy's testimony was detailed and devastating, but it was also clearly painful for him to provide. Several observers noted that Samuel appeared to take no satisfaction in his father's conviction, and that he seemed to understand the terrible price his family had paid for his moral courage. Judge William Morrison sentenced Jeremiah Henderson to death by hanging on 87 counts of murder. The sentence was carried out on July 4th, 1908, exactly 9 months after Samuel's midnight ride to Las Vegas had exposed the crimes. Jeremiah's final statement was brief and unrepentant. "I did what I had to do to provide for my family's future. If that makes me a monster, then history will judge whether I was right or wrong." Sarah Henderson's legal situation was resolved through a controversial decision by the Territorial Attorney General to grant her immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation with the investigation and her testimony at trial. While some critics argued that anyone who had knowingly participated in the murders should face justice, the judge ultimately supported this decision, noting that Sarah's information had been crucial in establishing the full scope of the crimes, and that she had clearly been more victim than accomplice. The aftermath of the Henderson case had far-reaching consequences for Las Vegas and the broader Nevada territory. The publicity surrounding the murders had damaged the region's reputation as a safe destination for travelers and investors, and local business leaders were deeply concerned about the long-term economic impact of the negative attention. Theodore Brackman, who had played a crucial role in exposing the crimes, eventually did purchase some of the land that had been the object of Jeremiah's obsession. However, he chose not to develop it immediately, instead allowing several years to pass before establishing the trading post and warehouse facilities that he had originally planned. When asked about his decision to delay development, Brackman simply stated that the land needed time to recover from the evil that had been done there. The Henderson homestead itself was abandoned immediately after the trial and remained vacant for decades. The territorial government made several attempts to find buyers for the property, but the notoriety of the crimes made it virtually unsaleable. The buildings were eventually demolished in 1912, and the land was left vacant until it was finally incorporated into the expanding Las Vegas city limits in the 1940s. Sarah Henderson and her surviving children relocated to Oregon under new identities provided by the territorial government. The decision to relocate was made both for their protection and to allow them to escape the notoriety that would have made normal lives impossible in Nevada. Sarah remarried in 1910 to a widowed farmer who was unaware of her previous circumstances, and she never spoke publicly about her experiences again. Samuel Henderson's life after the trial was marked by both achievement and ongoing psychological trauma. He used reward money that had been offered for information leading to the capture of the Henderson killers to pay for his education, eventually becoming a teacher and later a school administrator in Oregon. However, he struggled throughout his life with guilt over his role in his father's execution and the destruction of his family. In 1925, Samuel wrote a detailed memoir of his experiences, providing additional insight into the psychological impact of living with such terrible knowledge and the moral courage required to expose his father's crimes. The manuscript was not published during his lifetime, as Samuel remained concerned about protecting his sister's privacy and avoiding renewed public attention to their family's tragic history. Mary and Rebecca Henderson adapted more successfully to their new lives in Oregon. Both married and raised families, and neither spoke publicly about their childhood experiences. Mary became a nurse, perhaps influenced by memories of her mother's healing work, while Rebecca became a teacher like her brother Samuel. Both women maintained contact with Samuel throughout their lives, but they rarely discussed their shared past. The investigation of the Henderson murders led to significant changes in law enforcement procedures throughout Nevada Territory and the broader western region. The case demonstrated the need for better coordination between local and territorial authorities in investigating missing person cases, and it led to the establishment of new protocols for tracking individuals who disappeared while traveling through sparsely populated areas. Marshal Thompson, who had conducted the initial investigation and had been instrumental in bringing the case to trial, was promoted to territorial marshal, partly in recognition of his work on the Henderson case. He continued to investigate similar crimes throughout the Southwest and became known as one of the most effective law enforcement officers in the region. The burial ground where the Henderson victims were interred became a source of ongoing controversy within the Las Vegas community. Some residents believed that the bodies should be relocated to a proper cemetery, while others argued that the site should be left undisturbed as a memorial to the victims. The territorial government ultimately decided to leave the graves in place, marking the site with a simple stone monument that identified it as a memorial to victims of crime. The long-term impact of the Henderson murders on Las Vegas was significant, but gradually diminished as the city continued to grow rapidly. The completion of additional railroad connections and the discovery of mineral resources in nearby areas eventually brought new settlers and economic opportunities that overshadowed the notoriety of the crimes. When Nevada banned gambling in 1909, just 1 year after Jeremiah's execution, Las Vegas experienced a temporary economic downturn that some residents attributed to the lingering effects of the Henderson scandal. However, the city's incorporation in 1911 and its designation as the seat of the newly created Clark County marked the beginning of a new era of growth and respectability that gradually allowed the community to move beyond its dark past. The case files from the Henderson investigation were sealed by order of the territorial court in 1912. Primarily to protect the privacy of the surviving family members who had been granted new identities. The files remained classified for over 60 years, contributing to the gradual transformation of the case from documented history to local folklore. By 1920, when Las Vegas had grown to over 2,300 residents, the Henderson murders had become part of local oral tradition rather than recent memory. Old-timers would occasionally tell stories about the desert killer who had terrorized travelers in the early days, but these accounts were generally dismissed by newcomers as exaggerated frontier legends. The truth about the Henderson murders began to emerge again in the 1970s, when historians researching the early development of Las Vegas discovered references to the case in territorial archives that had been transferred to the Nevada State Archives. Even then, many details remained classified, and the full extent of Jeremiah Henderson's crimes was not widely known until the 1990s, when the remaining case files were finally made available to researchers under the state's historical preservation statutes. Modern forensic investigation of the burial ground, conducted in the 1980s as part of a historical preservation project, confirmed many details from the original investigation and revealed additional evidence about the systematic nature of the murders. The forensic evidence supported the conclusion that the killings had been planned and executed with the methodical precision of a business operation, consistent with the picture of Jeremiah Henderson that had emerged during his trial. The psychological profiles developed by modern criminologists who have studied the case provide insight into how an apparently normal frontier family could become involved in such systematic violence. Jeremiah has been classified as an organized serial killer who was motivated primarily by financial gain rather than psychological compulsion, making his case unusual in the annals of American criminal history. The Henderson case has been studied extensively by historians and criminologists as an example of how the social and economic pressures of frontier life could drive ordinary people to extraordinary acts of violence. The systematic nature of the crimes, the involvement of multiple family members, and the financial motivation for the murders make it unique among documented cases of serial killing in the American West. The case also serves as a reminder of the moral courage that individuals can display even in the most impossible circumstances. Samuel Henderson's decision to expose his father's crimes, despite the personal cost to himself and his family, has been cited by ethicists and historians as an example of how young people can sometimes demonstrate greater moral clarity than the adults around them. The impact on the surviving family members has been the subject of academic study, particularly the long-term psychological effects on children who witness systematic violence within their own families. The adaptation of Mary and Rebecca Henderson to normal lives after their traumatic childhood experiences has provided insights into the resilience of human beings in recovering from severe trauma. The Henderson murders also highlight the challenges faced by law enforcement in the sparsely populated territories of the American West during the early 20th century. The isolation of frontier communities made it possible for criminals to operate for extended periods without detection, and the limited resources available to territorial authorities made thorough investigations difficult even when crimes were reported. Today, the site of the Henderson homestead is part of a suburban development south of Las Vegas, near what is now the Henderson city limits. A community that was named not for the infamous family, but for Charles Henderson, a later political figure who had no connection to the murders. The burial ground has been preserved as a small memorial park, with a monument that acknowledges the victims without providing details about their deaths. The memorial bears a carefully worded inscription that reflects the community's desire to honor the victims while avoiding sensationalism. In memory of those who sought new beginnings in the Nevada desert and found only peace. May their souls rest in justice. The park includes interpretive displays that provide historical context about the growth of Las Vegas and the challenges of frontier law enforcement, while maintaining appropriate respect for both the victims and the surviving descendants of all families involved. The descendants of the Henderson family have largely remained private about their connection to the case. However, in 1998, one of Rebecca Henderson's granddaughters provided a brief interview to a University of Nevada researcher, offering insight into how the family legacy had affected subsequent generations. "The story was never hidden from us," she explained, "but it was never sensationalized either. We were taught that terrible things had happened, but that our family had also shown courage in stopping them. Samuel was always spoken of as a hero within our family, someone who had done the right thing despite the enormous personal cost. We learned that good people can sometimes find themselves in impossible situations, and that moral courage is often the only way out." This perspective reflects the complex legacy of the Henderson case, a story of horrific crimes but also of moral courage and the ultimate triumph of justice over evil. The case demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can choose to do what is right, regardless of the personal consequences. The Henderson murders remain one of the most thoroughly documented cases of serial killing in American frontier history. The survival of detailed journals, witness testimony, and physical evidence has allowed historians and criminologists to study the case in unprecedented detail, providing insights into the psychology of violence and the social conditions that can contribute to such crimes. The case also demonstrates the importance of community vigilance and effective law enforcement in preventing and stopping violent crime. The eventual exposure of Jeremiah Henderson's crimes came about through the combined efforts of suspicious community members, persistent law enforcement officers, and a family member who chose moral courage over personal safety. Modern Las Vegas, with its millions of annual visitors and world-renowned entertainment industry, bears little resemblance to the rough frontier railroad town where the Henderson murders took place. However, the case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about family violence, moral responsibility, and the factors that can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. The transformation of Las Vegas from a frontier settlement where such crimes could remain hidden for years into a modern city with sophisticated law enforcement and security systems reflects the broader evolution of American society during the 20th century. The Henderson case serves as a reminder of how far we have come, while also illustrating the eternal human capacity for both evil and heroism. The story of the Henderson family murders continues to fascinate researchers, writers, and students of American history because it encapsulates so many themes that are central to the American experience. The pursuit of prosperity and land ownership, the challenges of frontier life, the breakdown of moral constraints under extreme pressure, and the courage required to stand up for what is right, even when the cost is enormous. In the end, the Henderson case reminds us that the American dream has always carried within it the potential for both triumph and tragedy. Jeremiah Henderson's pursuit of land and prosperity in the growing frontier city of Las Vegas led him to commit some of the most systematic murders in American history. But his son Samuel's decision to expose those crimes, despite the destruction it would bring to his own family, demonstrates that moral courage can emerge even from the darkest circumstances. This mystery shows us how the promise of opportunity in America's frontier communities could corrupt even ordinary families when desperation meets the absence of moral constraints. But it also shows us that individuals can find the strength to do what is right, even when everything they love hangs in the balance. What do you think of this story? Could you have found the courage to do what Samuel Henderson did, knowing it would destroy your family but save countless innocent lives? Do you believe that the American dream itself creates pressures that can lead people to abandon their moral principles? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about the choices made by each member of the Henderson family. If you enjoyed this tale of greed, murder, and moral courage in the early American West, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. There are more secrets buried in America's past. Stories of ordinary families who faced extraordinary choices in the pursuit of the American dream and the consequences that followed. We're here to uncover them all, one haunting tale at a time. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter in the hidden history of our nation's most haunting places.